The day began with an unusual silence in Vatican City. It wasn't the typical quiet of early morning, nor the customary reverence that surrounds the Holy See in its sacred routines. This was a different silence, dense, almost prophetic. Deep within the Apostolic Palace, in a room barely lit by the light filtering through a white curtain, lay Pope Francis. Though he was not alone, he seemed to be. His serene and slightly pale face rested on a simple pillow. At his feet, in prayerful posture, were two nuns who had accompanied him for years, discreet like faithful shadows of the silent gospel he had preached. The clock read 5:43 in the morning when Francis slowly opened his eyes. He didn't have the strength to speak fluently, but his gaze communicated intensely. He slightly raised his hand, gesturing for them to leave him alone for a few minutes. Once they left, he took the crucifix resting on his chest and brought it to his lips, whispering something only the crucifix could hear. It was then that he asked for those not on the Vatican protocol list to enter. Not cardinals or ambassadors, but his family. 3 people entered. A woman with gray hair and a face marked by tears. It was his sister, alongside her 2 nephews, one a priest, the other a father. As soon as they saw him, tears sprang forth, as if everything unsaid for decades had waited for this moment. They didn't know whether to kneel or hug him. He smiled. His voice, though weak, still retained its usual tenderness. "Don't cry. I haven't left yet," he said with a fleeting smile. Then he asked for the door to be closed and for no one else to enter. What happened next was not simply a farewell. It was a revelation, a heavenly inheritance, an act that seemed taken from the most intimate pages of the Acts of the Apostles. Francis asked them to sit next to him and began to speak, not about politics, not about his achievements, not even about his papacy. He spoke of the soul, of forgiveness, of the inner emptiness that human feels when they believe they have understood everything but have not truly loved. His sister, unable to contain herself, took his hand and asked, "Brother, do you regret anything?" The room was enveloped in painful silence. He took a deep breath and responded, "Of having kept silent about love so many times." At that moment, he asked his nephew, the priest, to read a passage from the Gospel according to St. John, chapter 17. "Father, the hour has come. Glorify your Son, so that the Son may glorify you." As they listened, they understood that Francis was not leaving a simple message. He was leaving his last intimate Mass, a farewell liturgy between blood, flesh, and tears. There were no hosts, but there was truth. There was no incense, but there was heaven. He took an elderly letter from under the sheet, one he had written by hand months before. His trembling hand still had the strength to sign the letter that would be opened minutes after his death. He was speaking directly to his family, but also to the world. "If anything in my life leave a mark on you, let it not be the position I held, but the love I tried to give. I loved badly many times, but I loved with truth, and I hope that will be enough for me to see the face of God." His sister, who had been an atheist for years, knelt and kissed his forehead. At that moment, he wasn't the Pope. He was her brother, the same one who played with her in the streets of Florence, who protected her from insults, who cried in silence when she was sick. Francis had bared his soul before those he loved most, and that revelation was more than painful. It was sacred. When the Vatican doctors entered, they found the Pope asleep, not unconscious, but deeply at peace. He clung to the crucifix like a child to its blanket. His last breath would come hours later, but what was truly eternal had already happened in that room. His family, even with tears in their eyes, emerged not destroyed but transformed, like the disciples at Emmaus. They finally understood what they had never understood before. Jesus also lives in those who die with love. The aged letter the Pope had handed out that morning contained no logistical instructions, no details about possessions, not even honorable mentions. What it held was a manifesto of the soul, written with the ink of the Spirit and the fragility of a life that had carried on its shoulders the weight of the world and the cross. The letter was opened in the private chapel of the Vatican by his sister, sitting in front of the altar where Francis had prayed so many times. Silence without cameras, without the faithful, without pulpits, only God and him. The paper trembled between his fingers, while the light of a candle flickered too, as if heaven itself were expectant. Then he began to read aloud, as if each word needed to be heard not only by his family, but by all humanity. The letter began with a phrase that seemed like the echo of a prophecy. To whoever holds this paper in their hands, I leave the only thing I can give without losing it, my truth. That first emotional blow broke the barrier between the sacred and the human. In those lines, Francis laid himself completely bare. He explained how, despite having been the pastor of the Universal Church, at times he had felt more like a sheep than a pastor. He confessed that there were entire nights when he cried in his room without anyone knowing, tormented by the loneliness that comes with responsibility, by the weight of knowing that his words could move consciences or destroy them. He asked for forgiveness not as a pope, but as a son, a brother, a sinner. In one of the most intense fragments, he said, "To you who are my blood sister and also my sister in faith, I beg you not to allow my mistakes to be your excuse to walk away from God. If I ever failed you as a brother, may this writing repair what I failed to repair in life. Forgive me and come home." Faith is not a place where there are no cracks. It is the home where cracks heal. The family, upon hearing that, was broken. It was not simply a letter. It was a mirror. Each word touched old fibers, family conflicts, silences accumulated over the years. The voice of the Pope was not only felt on the paper. It was felt in their chest. It was as if Francis was reading to them from another plane, still sitting in front of them, but with the eyes of someone who had already seen the eternal. In the middle of the letter, Francis changed his tone. He no longer spoke as a family member, but as a pastor. He left them a series of principles, not commandments, not orders, but callings. Never be ashamed to forgive first. Love even when the other does not deserve it, because love that does not hurt does not purify. If you ever have to choose between being right and having peace, choose peace. Christ did not win arguments. He won souls. Do not let resentment poison you. The grave will always be bigger than your pride. Pray even when you don't feel anything, even when it seems useless. Prayer doesn't always move God, but it always moves you. These phrases weren't pious advice. They were wounds transformed into wisdom. Each one reflected a moment in his life. Conflicts with clergy, internal tensions, struggles with ideological extremes, even with his own character. The letter became an X-ray of the pontifical soul, and at the same time a life manual for his own. Towards the end, Francis asked them for one final act. Not a mass in his honor, not an ostentatious tomb. He asked them for a simple but eternal gesture. Bury me with the rosary that my mother used. Not out of nostalgia, but because each bead I touched on that rosary brought me closer to God than all the speeches I gave. It was then that his sister burst into tears, seeing that among his things was indeed that worn rosary with a broken wooden bead and another tied with a red thread. It was an imperfect rosary, but real, like his faith, like his life, like his legacy. He closed the letter with what would be the most shared phrase after his death, one that would become the banner of a new generation of believers. Don't make me a martyr. Make me an excuse to love again. The paper was folded with great care. The tears were no longer of pain, but of gratitude. In that instant, they understood that the Pope had not died, that what he left in that letter was stronger than his physical presence, that he had gone from being a world leader to being an intimate light that would continue to burn in the hearts of his loved ones. After the reading of the letter, the atmosphere in the room had changed. It was as if an invisible, dense cloak of memory and truth covered everything. No one spoke. The echo of Francis's words continued to float between the walls of that intimate chapel. But there was still more. His sister, visibly moved, said in a low voice, "He is not going to leave without saying what he carries inside. Not everything is in that letter." Hours before his body stopped responding, the Pope requested one final moment without assistants, cameras, or clergy, just his sister, his two nephews, and an old tape recorder he kept in his desk. He expressed his desire to leave his true testimony, not as the Pope, but as Jorge Mario Bergoglio, the young Argentine, the confused seminarian, the man who lived between the extremes of duty and desire. The audio, kept secret by the family, began with a phrase that would shock the world if it were ever made public. I have loved more than I should have, and I have also kept quiet more than I could. It was not a confession of scandal, but a declaration of humanity. Francis spoke of his years as a young Jesuit and how there were times when he doubted everything about God, the church, and his vocation. He recalled how, when he was just over 20 years old, he felt a deep love for a young woman to whom he never confessed his feelings out of fear, duty, and obedience. She never knew that I loved her, not because ours could not be, but because I was afraid that if I loved her, I would lose God. Today I know that God is not lost by loving. He is found. That phrase, spoken with a broken voice, opened a crack in the heart of his family because for the first time they saw the Pope not as a stained glass saint, but as a man with desires, longings, and decisions that broke him inside. He also recounted how, in his early years as a bishop, he made mistakes by harshly judging priests who needed help more than punishment. I wanted to purify the church, but sometimes I forgot that the church is not a museum of cigars but a hospital for sinners. He spoke of the fear he felt every time he went out onto the balcony of St. Peter's. It wasn't joy. It was vertigo, a sacred fear. I felt like my whole history was weighing on my shoulders, my childhood, my mistakes, my silences, my country, my neighborhood. He confessed something unexpected. For years, I had nightmares in which God asked me, "Were you a shepherd or just a doorman of the temple?" This question tormented me until I understood that being a shepherd is not knowing everything or having clean hands, but walking with the sheep, smelling like them, and getting dirty with their pain. He also confessed something that marked him deeply. When an anonymous letter came into his hands falsely accusing him of covering up a case he had actually reported privately. That forced silence almost broke him inside. I wanted to respond, but God asked me to remain silent. I learned that not all truths should be shouted. Some are buried like seeds. It was that experience, he said, that led him to trust more in the Holy Spirit than in human courts. Perhaps the strongest moment was when he confessed his most intimate fear. Not of dying, not of getting sick, but of being forgotten by God. I confess sometimes I prayed and felt nothing. Sometimes I took communion and felt more like a sinner than redeemed. But I continued because faith is not certainty. It is fidelity. It is looking at the sky and seeing nothing, but continuing to walk as if you saw everything. In those final minutes, he also revealed a deep love for the figure of St. Peter. Peter taught me that there is no faith without betrayal, that sometimes one denies Christ without realizing it. But Christ, even knowing that, continues to tell you, "Feed my sheep." That is true forgiveness. He who knows your betrayal and still entrusts you with his flock. The audio ended with a phrase that, according to his sister, was like a burning flame that no one can extinguish. If you ever wonder if it was worth it, tell them this. I was not perfect, but I was of God, and that was enough for me. As he closed the recorder, his sister kissed his hand with devotion. She was no longer crying for his death, but for everything they had kept silent for decades, and that now, in that testimony, she had found redemption. There was no confessional, no ritual absolution, but there, in a room where faith was stripped of protocol, the purest confession was born, that of the soul that surrenders completely. What Pope Francis left in words was not an ideology, but a spiritual direction, a lit beacon for a church that, although ancient, needs to continue renewing itself so as not to remain trapped in its ways, losing its essence. His last reflections were not speeches written for the crowds, but thoughts dictated with his naked heart, recorded by his nephew, a priest, in a notebook that is still preserved today as an intimate treasure. Here, Francis outlined his theological vision for the future of the church, not as an academic theologian, but as a shepherd who bleeds with his sheep. He warned that if the church forgets the Christ of the dusty roads and retreats into palaces, it will lose its soul. I prefer a church wounded from walking than neat from being still, he said, synthesizing his entire vision, a church that is active and incarnate, not theoretical. Francis did not dream of larger temples or more elaborate rituals. He envisioned a church that was more human, more merciful, and more courageous. His first call was clear. Faith should cease to be a label and once again become an experience of encounter. In his notebook, he outlined 5 pillars he considered fundamental for the future. The gospel as a starting point. The gospel should not be a final ornament, but the foundation guiding every pastoral decision, every structure, every gesture. If the gospel is uncomfortable, it is because it is alive, he said. Francis urged against domesticating Christ's message, denouncing lukewarm homilies, soulless documents, and liturgies that become mere spectacles. He called for a radical return to the living Christ, the uncomfortable Christ who challenges the powerful and the complacent. The role of women. Francis acknowledged the Church's historical debt to women, admitting failures to listen, believe, and include them in decision-making. He envisioned a church where women not only have a voice, but a vote, allowed to form, decide, and even govern communities in full communion, not through quotas or marketing strategies, but through evangelical justice. A church for the poor. A poor church for the poor is not a slogan. It is the core. Francis insisted that clerical luxury undermines credibility. You cannot preach about the manger in Bethlehem and live like Herod, he said. He criticized ecclesiastical structures that serve themselves rather than the faithful, dreaming of parishes that are shelters, not offices, with priests who smell of the street, sweat, and pain, and a people who live their faith from wound to wound. The culture of encounter. For Francis, Christianity was never meant to be a trench, but a crossroads. The church must excel in embracing without questioning. God does not check credentials before loving, he said, emphasizing openness to migrants, the divorced, and those marginalized by orientation or life situation. He did not relativize doctrine, but made mercy the gateway, insisting that without compassion, no doctrine can save. Synodality. The church is not a pyramid. It is a caravan. Francis dreamed of a church that walks together, where bishops listen to laypeople and laypeople listen to the Spirit. He rejected clericalism disguised as authority, advocating for structures where all participate, not where a few command. We are not owners of the truth. We are servants of the mystery, he declared. These pillars were not official documents, but thoughts, sighs of the soul that emerged as his body was shutting down. Yet they contained prophetic power to influence future generations. In one of the last sentences of that notebook, written in almost illegible handwriting, he stated, "I prefer a church that is wrong in loving than one that is right in condemning." In the margin, he added a note seemingly directed at his successor. "Brother, do not be afraid to appear weak. Be afraid to appear strong. That is what prevented many from becoming saints." His legacy was not dogma, but a path. He left no cathedrals. He left his mark and, above all, open questions, those not closed by theologies but by daily decisions. The last pope who did not seek to shine ended up shining more than anyone else. On the morning of the pope's death, there were no bells ringing or flags at half-mast. Vatican City seemed hushed, as if even the marble had learned to keep silent. Outside, rumors spread through diplomatic corridors and Vatican passageways, but inside the private enclosure where Francis's body lay, everything was sacred, not because of protocol, but because of humanity. There was no supreme pontiff, but rather his brother, his uncle, the man who had often swallowed his tears for duty and was now finally being mourned. His sister, sitting on the edge of the chair closest to the event, held a small black leather case in her hands. It wasn't a reliquary or a Vatican jewel. It was the old case containing her mother's rosary, the one Jorge Mario used as a teenager when he prayed with her during stormy nights in Buenos Aires. He had jealously guarded it even after being elected pope, and now, by his decision, it had been given to her, not on a whim, but as a mission. She opened it with trembling hands, revealing a rosary with beads worn out by use, one of them broken and tied with red thread in the middle. alongside a simple cross without ornaments. Next to it was a small handwritten note. "When you don't hear me, pray with this. I will be there." The phrase fell like a stone on his sister's soul. She had spent her whole life knowing her brother was special, but she never imagined how much he had loved her in silence. He never expressed it with flowery words or wrote long letters. But in that gesture, she understood that all the love he didn't say was left sewn in each bead of the rosary. Her crying was immediate, not a hysterical cry, but a silent one, born in the stomach and rising like contained lava. She was not alone. Her nephews also broke down upon seeing her, and in that instant, the entire room became a chapel without the need for an altar. There was no mass celebrated there, but an intimate resurrection, because the more they cried, the more they understood that Francis was not leaving. He remained in each tear that cleansed the soul, in each redeemed memory, in each prayer that would spring from the silence of that rosary. She approached the body, not touching it first, only leaning down with her forehead against the white sheet, whispering, "I forgive you for everything you kept quiet, and thank you for never stopping loving me, even though you never told me." It was a prayer, a confession, an act of reconciliation without intermediaries. And when she finally dared to kiss his forehead, she said a phrase that would be forever engraved in those present. "You were not the Pope to me. You were the brother that God used to call me back." That moment was discreetly photographed by a close collaborator, not for media purposes, but as testimony to an irrefutable truth, that holiness is not found in cathedrals, but in gestures born from the most sincere love. In that scene, a paradigm was broken because the legacy of a pope was not hung on the walls of history, nor enclosed in official documents. It remained beating in a worn rosary, in a reconciled sister, in a family that no longer needed words to know itself complete. The image of her embracing the rosary next to her brother's body traveled the world in a matter of hours. But what was moving was not the aesthetics of the scene. It was the truth it contained, the truth of a life given not to be adored but to be imitated. And so, the Pope who refused to be a statue became a living memory. The shepherd who rejected luxury became a symbol of unadorned love. The man who spoke little of himself ended up being heard in the deepest corners of the human soul. The body of Pope Francis had already been prepared. He was dressed simply in his white cassock, the stole he wore during his first Mass as pontiff, and in his right hand, the rosary his mother taught him to pray with. There was no mitre, no gold rings. This is what he had asked for, that his death not be a ceremony, but an act of worship. That request was respected like an unwritten last wish, sealed in the hearts of those who loved him. The private chapel of the Vatican, with its dim light filtering through sober stained glass windows, welcomed about 20 people, no more. Close relatives, intimate collaborators, and a small group of nuns who had accompanied him as silent guardians of his soul were present. There were no cardinals or press, no Gregorian chant or large orchestras, just a small, barely audible organ and the constant murmur of prayers that were not pronounced with the mouth but from the center of the chest. The gospel they chose was no coincidence. It had been pointed out by him in his last days. John 21 verses 15 to 17. "Do you love me? Feed my sheep." That scene between Jesus and Peter was, for Francis, the perfect summary of pastoral ministry. It was not about power, doctrine, or hierarchies. It was about love, loving despite the falls, continuing to feed even with broken knees, never abandoning the sheep even when they abandoned the shepherd. The priest presiding over the Mass was his nephew, who trembled as he approached the altar. Before beginning, he said in a low voice, "Uncle, today I'm not celebrating for you. I am celebrating with you." And then the liturgy began. The words of the Mass sounded familiar, but carried a different weight. Each "Lord have mercy" felt like a personal plea. Each "We give thanks" was accompanied by images, memories, laughter, silences, wounds, and healings. It wasn't a ritual repetition. It was an explosion of meaning. During the homily, the priest spoke not as a nephew, but as a disciple, and through tears he said, "Many will remember him as the Pope of the poor, the shepherd of the periphery, the man who washed the feet of the forgotten. I will remember him as the man who did not stop believing even when he felt nothing. His faith was not a spectacle. It was a flame that burned without making noise, and that flame is now within us. The most moving moment came during the consecration when the bread and wine were elevated. Everyone in the room seemed to hold their breath. It was as if time had stopped. The silence was not the absence of sound. It was the fullness of presence. In that instant, everyone knew without words that the Pope was there. Not in the coffin, but on the altar, not as a body, but as a living memory in the mystery of Christ who breaks and distributes. When communion arrived, his sister approached trembling. She had never before taken communion since she left the church, but that morning she did, not out of ritual or tradition, but out of love. In the consecrated bread, she found her brother and also that God of whom she had doubted so much. It was the most powerful reconciliation that Francis ever preached, the one that happened in silence, in a soul returned home. At the end of the Mass, there was no applause, only a soft song, almost like a lullaby. Nothing troubles you, nothing frightens you. The hymn of Saint Teresa that he used to recite in moments of anguish. The voices trembled, the air was thick, and at the same time, there was an indecipherable sensation of profound peace, as if heaven had settled on earth for a few minutes to embrace those who mourned. The coffin was carefully carried to the center of the chapel. It had no decorations, only a wooden cross engraved with his baptismal name, Jorge Mario Bergoglio, and below it a simple phrase in Latin, Servus Pauperum Dei, servant of the poor of God. Before closing the ceremony, his sister placed a white flower on the coffin and spoke with a firm voice, this time without tears. Now, yes, brother, you can go in peace. You leave us with a broken heart, but with an open soul. And so, between tears that no longer hurt, between prayers that needed no explanation, and between silences that spoke more than sermons, the most intimate, most real, most holy Mass of his entire pontificate was celebrated. The afternoon fell slowly over Rome that day. The Vatican, bathed in an almost biblical orange light, seemed to sleep, as if the entire earth had breathed its last next to the soul of the one who had departed. The bells did not ring as usual. Instead of announcing death, they sounded like the echo of a mission accomplished, like the tolling of a goodbye that was more luminous than painful. The Pope had departed, but something in the air had not gone away. In the following days, while the entire world processed the news, stories began to multiply. Memories, photographs, and phrases from Pope Francis that now seemed to resonate with a different force. What was once a speech now became prophetic word. What was once read with respect was now felt with fire in the heart. Because when someone whose life was a mirror of Christ dies, their message ceases to be theirs and becomes part of the living gospel. In Buenos Aires, an anonymous woman left a letter at the parish where Jorge Mario had been baptized. It simply read, "Thank you, Bergoglio. I returned to the faith because you did not judge me when everyone else did." In the Philippines, a group of young people founded a network to help the homeless, naming it Francisco. Missionaries living in Africa began to quote his speeches as a pastoral guide, especially the one where he said, "Do not expect the world to change from a pulpit. Change it from a healed wound." His most profound legacy was not measured in works, but in conversions of the soul. Men who had distanced themselves from the church began to pray again. Women wounded by ecclesiastical contempt began to trust again in the God he preached. Tired priests found in his life a reason not to give up, and in thousands of homes, the rosary began to ring again between fingers that had previously forgotten it. His sister, in an interview she never planned to give, expressed it with words that touched millions. "My brother did not die as a pope. He died as the Son of God, and that is more eternal than any throne." His discreet tomb became a place of constant prayer. It was not a mausoleum, but a stone bench with a phrase engraved in Italian. "I did not fear the night because I knew who belonged there." Without fanfare or golden statues, each day began with a line of ordinary people with broken stories seeking comfort. Some left flowers, others letters, others simply touched the stone and cried. But they all left changed, because a true legacy is not measured by what you leave behind, but by what you awaken in others. His face was no longer only in official portraits. It appeared on murals in poor neighborhoods, in children's drawings, in the dreams of seminarians, and in the homilies of humble priests who quoted him without fear of seeming simple-minded, because he himself taught them that faith is, above all, luminous simplicity, even within the church. His death sparked something unexpected, a silent revolution. Some bishops began to open up to dialogue. Religious congregations reformed in his honor, and in the conclave that followed, it was heard more than once the whisper, "Francis left us no rules. He left us direction." That direction was clear: to return to the heart of Christ, not through power, control, or fear, but through incarnate love, the love that sits with the rejected, weeps with the broken, listens without correction, the love that doesn't ask who you are, but how you are. That was his true legacy, one that doesn't need to be canonized to become eternal, one that is passed on from soul to soul, from wound to wound, from embrace to embrace. Francis had died, but the promise of eternity he left behind was stronger than death, because when a man gives his life for love, when he empties himself to the last drop for a better world, when he stops preaching and begins to embody, he doesn't die, he sows. And the world, the true world he dreamed of, where the last will be first, has already begun to flourish. As the world continued to reflect on the life and legacy of Francis, his teachings and actions resonated more deeply with each passing day. Communities around the globe found inspiration in his humble approach and unwavering commitment to love and service. In schools, children learned about his life as a testament to compassion and empathy. In churches, his words echoed in sermons, reminding the faithful of the power of simple, genuine faith. Francis's influence transcended religious boundaries, touching the hearts of those from all walks of life. His message of love and acceptance became a guiding light in a world often divided by differences. People began to see each other not as strangers, but as brothers and sisters, united by a shared humanity. In the years to come, the seeds Francis had sown continued to grow, nurturing a garden of hope and change. His legacy lived on in the actions of those he inspired, a testament to the enduring power of a life lived for others. And so, in the quiet moments of reflection, when the world seemed at its most chaotic, the gentle whisper of his teachings could be heard, reminding us all that true greatness lies not in power or prestige, but in the simple, profound act of loving one another.